Hi everyone, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks today. We are a digital talk series bringing you the best creative voices across film, television, and theater. And today we are so fortunate to be joined by the fantastic Tom Ellis to talk all things Lucifer and the current season 5. And I wanted to start by asking you, about the twin side of it all, because obviously you had the character Michael coming into the show this season, and that was such an interesting challenge. And what was fascinating was you made such great choices with how you were playing him so differently that it really kind of brought a lot of awareness to the way that you had been playing Lucifer throughout, and even just the body language, the way you keep him very open in terms of just like holding his arms open a lot to go along with the way that he approaches people. So what was that process when you were first taking on this character and figuring out the physicality of Lucifer to match his demeanor in that way?
To match Lucifer's demeanor.
Yeah.
In the first instance, I mean, the thing is about Lucifer, I guess it's a double-sided question really, because when I was working on Lucifer, all that sort of stuff, that body language of Lucifer came out quite naturally with the type of person that he was, and he had this sort of vivacious quality about him, and he was very open and very kind of like intrusive of people's space and things like that. That I didn't notice it quite so much until I started working on Michael this season. And then it was like, my sort of problem that I gave myself was that I wanted to make Lucifer and Michael very different. And we didn't have time in the filming process to do like big, like prosthetic differences or anything like that. So I really had to think old school. I had to go back to my drama school roots and think about creating a character and how I would do that and how it would be, or why it would be different to Lucifer. So, for example, Lucifer being a big open character, I was like, okay, well, my first step is I want to make Michael closed. And, that might just mean as an attitude, or it might mean physically closed. And so Lucifer's like this, and the opposite of that is this. And as I sort of brought myself in, and this is stuff I was just trying out on my feet with Ildi and with Sherwin, who was our director of the second episode that Michael properly came into. And I was like, what am I doing here, guys? So, I started walking around in the room trying to find some kind of weight and gravity to this character. And that physical thing was the first thing I started with. I went in like this, and then I wanted him to speak differently to Lucifer, so I opted to go for an American dialect. And, he was a man of much fewer words. And, he was described to me as an observer and a listener, and not someone who's always on the front foot like Lucifer is, someone who lurks in the shadows. Those were my starting points, really. I think, a thing that I really remember from drama school was about shoes, about characters' shoes. And this sounds bizarre to people that don't know, but in a rehearsal room, you're never wearing your costume. And when you're doing a play in the theatre, you never wear your costume in a rehearsal room. But what you will do from pretty much the start is try and find a pair of shoes that the character would walk in, because it actually dictates a huge amount of your physicality and a huge amount of your presence in a space. And so, I started, I asked the costume department just to get me some really horrible shoes. Because Lucifer's really stylish and all that. I just wanted the most horrible loafers that they could find that were really clumpy. And I just started sort of adding layers to this, to the character of Michael that I was trying to etch out. And then, of course, the other thing that you have to bear in mind is his attitude about the world and, what it is that he wants. What is his main objective? And, start kind of playing with all those things. And that's basically how I started getting the yin to Lucifer's yang.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the dialect as well, because you were mentioning how, you gave him an American accent, and that was one of the pieces of it, because you've talked in the past about your early experience working on Buffalo Soldiers and not necessarily having the confidence at that point with your American accent, and it ended up being dubbed. And I was really interested in kind of what that journey was from then to now, and how you've become more comfortable with doing dialect, particularly, as a British actor coming over to the States, it's almost somewhat of a necessity to be able to work over here as well.
Absolutely. I mean, it's coming from the UK, there are so many dialects in the UK. And, that was something that I was very comfortable doing, actually, ever since I've started acting. I love working in dialect. But specifically at that point in my career, it was different British dialects. Coming to America, there's a kind of, I hadn't been to America by that point that I was doing Buffalo Soldiers. That's the other thing that's quite important here, is that you have a version of an American accent that you think is right. but like all dialects, you know, they're very specific to the individual, and they're very specific to where that person is from. So to say that there is a general American accent is like saying there's a general British accent. There just isn't. So the thing that you have to find out is the consistency within the accent, in the dialect. And then the most important thing that I've learned, you know, since that Buffalo Soldiers experience came when I was doing a play. And it was an American play about an American family, and it was 5 British actors, but an American director and the American writer was with us in the rehearsal process. And about a week into rehearsals, and these are all brilliant actors, about a week into rehearsals, everyone had been doing their American accents. And he stopped us and said, guys, you've got to stop. You've got to stop being British people with American accents and start being American. And that was a kind of eureka moment for me, because it wasn't just about putting on a voice. It was about the other things that go alongside it, like the attitude, the delivery, very, very different to British sensibilities. And so breaking through that aspect of it and being American was the thing that I needed to do. And when I worked on that play and I started working within that character, within that rehearsal process, and then doing it on stage every night, I suddenly started to feel much more locked in about what it was to be American. And then, you know, it was either a coincidence or it's fate or whatever you want to call it. But in the final week of that play, I got a script sent through for a pilot of a show called Rush. And that was my first kind of big break in America, playing a leading character. And he was American and all those things, but because I was so locked in at that moment in time, I just felt so comfortable auditioning for it, and putting myself there and believing that I was American. And I got the job, and that's really where it just started to flourish for me, because then I came over and did the job, and I did the thing that I didn't think anyone that I would ever do. I didn't think I'd ever be one of these actors, but I stayed in dialects the entire time from the moment I left my house in the morning to when I got back at night, I was American, and I never slipped into my British accent once, which sounds weird and kind of crazy, but it was really, really helpful, because what I stopped doing was thinking about American dialect.
Yeah.
And that was, you know, you had to kind of like live the character and stop thinking about just specifically someone's voice and how the rest of that person affects their voice and who they are and what they do.
Mm-hmm. Which obviously wouldn't have been possible playing both of these characters within these scenes together. And I was interested in the fact that it wasn't just that you had a stand-in for whichever character you were playing against within those scenes with both of the brothers together, that it was an acting double. And I wanted to ask you about like the specific reason why that was a huge benefit to you, and you know that you had someone who understood the character, could actually deliver the lines, and that you could also give notes to and say, this is how I'm approaching the character of Michael, this is how these lines are going to be delivered, and how that really helped you in playing against yourself on screen ultimately.
It was totally new territory. I've never done this before, so it was totally new territory for me. And they gave me the option. They said, do you want someone just to read in, or do you want us to like hire an acting double? And I was like, I think we definitely need an acting double, because you know, like anyone will tell you, and you know, if you're in a scene with somebody, you're only as good as the person that's hitting the ball back to you. It's like a game of tennis. So you know, actors who've sort of auditioned a lot will find, you know, will identify with this, in that if someone is just reading the lines to you, it's really difficult to kind of like manufacture a truthful response, because it's about energy going back and forth. So I said, get an acting double, and they hired this guy, Phil, who was fantastic. And he came in and he'd learned all the lines for both characters. And, you know, from the start, he was, you know, he had a real humility about him, which was super helpful, because sometimes you so up against it for time, and just giving someone sort of bullet point notes in the moment can feel quite abrasive and rushed. But he was so responsive to all of that. And yeah, it was kind of crazy, because we were blocking a scene, and I'd be Lucifer in the scene, and he'd come in as Michael, and he'd work off his instincts. But then I was sort of gauging what my instincts would be, seeing the character, and go, I think you'd probably be over here by this point, and just trying to gain some shape to the whole thing. I guess it was closer to a sort of directorial experience than I've ever had before. but it was incredibly helpful to have an acting double. If I'd done it, you know, with a tennis ball on a lighting stand or anything else, I just it wouldn't have felt the same.
Yeah. Well, in terms of effects, one of the things that we've seen you do a little bit more is as we've seen Lucifer's demon face coming into it, there's a lot more CGI effects in that. In the process for you filming that is having the tracking dots on your face. So how does that force a completely different type of performance? And what does that look like for the performance that you're giving for camera, knowing that ultimately it has to have an emotional core to it, but visually it's going to look very different?
Yeah, I mean, the technology has really advanced as well since we've been doing the show. So at first, the first incarnations of Lucifer's devil face in the first season are very, very different to what we see now. I wasn't able to talk as Lucifer with the devil face when we first had him. That's how kind of basic it was. And now, and then we went through a process of, I had to wear like a skull cap and dots and all these, and I looked ridiculous with a big camera like off my head pointing at my face and all these things. Trying to do a scene with Lauren German with that on my head was the hardest thing in the world, because she likes to laugh. But yeah, I think like I try not to think, because the tech guys and the special effect guys that come in and help me, I said, just give your performance. And we will do the rest. Like always stating, the most important thing is the eyes. And the truth of an actor will always be seen in their eyes, whatever they're doing, whether it's mask work or whether it's just anything at all. It's all in here. So I just had to kind of maintain the belief that I was Lucifer, and once I'd seen the post-production stuff of what they were doing, that was great, but I kind of can't think about that. I've just got to, assume that skin is already on me, and just play it as truthfully as I can from that.
Yeah. One of the other interesting things that, in your process overall was that you've mentioned how even when you film scenes from an episode that you still, at the end of the night, take the script home and reread the entire episode to really just reestablish the entire lay of the land. And I wanted to ask about like how that became an integral part of your process, particularly for working on television.
I think again when I did Rush, actually, because there's a lot of things at play. I mean, there's so many words to learn in such a short amount of time. And you're not filming in sequence, so that remembering where you are, where you've been, and where you're about to go to, and all those things, it can become very complicated. And I just found that the easiest way for me to do it was because I think it's about brain training as well. Like if you're at work all day, weirdly the easiest time for me to learn my lines is at the end of that day, because my head is in some kind of space where I'm just in the story, I've been living it for the day. So that's kind of like my hotspot. So I will come home, and rather than look at my lines for the next day, I'll read through the script. And the more stuff we've shot, the quicker that process becomes. But what it does do is it just helps me energize and infuse the scenes that we still are yet to do. And it helps sort of carry that energy forward. And I don't think everyone does that, and it's a bit time consuming, but it also means that I don't sit there for ages like looking at a script and then looking away trying to remember lines, because weirdly by doing this process it happens by osmosis. So I'm just it sounds slightly crazy, but it's the most helpful thing I've ever done, certainly when I'm doing non-sequential filming.
Yeah. I wanted to also talk a little bit about the overall tone of the show, because it pulls in so many different dynamics. Your performance is both comedic, but then there's also procedural elements to it. There's a very dramatic side to it. There's a lot of kind of stunt and action work. And so do you kind of like sit there with the scripts and kind of figure out what the different tones and beats are going to be? Because even within a scene, you're often touching on 2 or 3 of those different directions within your performance.
Yeah, I mean, I think by now I've sort of, it's just essential thing for me. Like I've been doing the character of Lucifer for such a long time, and working with these scripts and these writers for such a long time, that I kind of know roughly what the beats are. I like to be very specific about stuff. So when I'll work on things, but then when I'm on the set with the writer of the episode and I don't quite get something, or something isn't quite working, I will always go to them and say, what did you mean by this when you were writing it? Or what was it you were after when you wrote this? And if it still isn't quite resonating, we'll tweak it and work it, and because essentially that's what we want. We want something translated, the idea translated as truthfully as possible onto the screen. And sometimes that's lost in translation a little bit. But yeah, it's always been a very collaborative process on Lucifer. I think that, you know, there's a lack of ego there, which is really, really helpful when you're working at this pace creatively. And it's always been a kind of best idea wins scenario. Yeah.
Yeah. And when it comes to characters, one of the things that the show does so well is, you know, beyond just how developed the character of Lucifer is, all of the supporting characters have so many different layers, and they really think in depth about not just the narrative arc that they're going on, but how they're going to respond to situations, what their backstory is. And I wanted to ask you about like how that's a valuable tool for you, particularly when you were starting out on the show, to have more information about these characters, to be able to respond to them as scene partners and figure out what that dynamic was going to look like on screen together.
I mean, it's been a kind of natural evolution because, you know, when you start these things, you don't know how long they're going to go for. And you don't know, you can only go with what you've got in front of you. So if I think about our pilot script now, you know, now at the end of, you know, season 5 of Lucifer, and I look back at our pilot script, it probably feels very surface, because it literally is setting the tone and just sketching out, you know, roughly what this is going to be. And that includes character development as well. You know, when you're shooting a pilot, this is new territory for me as the actor to kind of step into these shoes every day. And that, you know, over 5 years, that becomes like putting on a piece of clothing. It's like putting on a glove now. But before, you know, there's a lot of self-doubt and all those things that come with it. And it's the same for all the actors in that process. So, you know, I don't know if Lauren and I would really have thought that the Decker Star thing would have developed in the way that it has, for example, over 5 years of the show. But we've gone with it because we've trusted in our characters and we've trusted in the writing. And, you know, we found a way to believe that and root for that as the performers.
Yeah. I also love that in terms of the musical moments within the show, when you're sitting down at the piano, that's not just a case of them giving you a script and saying, this is going to be the musical moment that you're going to perform, but you're actually involved in the arrangement of it and working with the composers to figure out what that's going to look like. So how does that help you in terms of really being able to make those moments, you know, not just kind of like a fun musical moment, but really speak to the development and evolution of your character?
Well, the music has always been part of the language of the show, and certainly part of Lucifer's language, because what he can't express verbally, he certainly can express musically. So every time that the idea of a song has come in, they've always come to me and said, what do you think? You know, what are your ideas for songs as source material initially? And then, you know, when we've got the song, we have to think technically about how much screen time we have. And I always want the song to serve as part of our story. So a song in itself is a storytelling device. So, you know, I always want to, even if we've got only a minute and a half of screen time, I want a beginning, middle, and end to this song. So it helps push our story forward. It's a little bit like, you know, if you watch X Factor or American Idol or something like that, you know, all these kind of famous songs that we know, they have to find a 90-minute version of it. So it's good, sorry, a 90-second version of it. So it's, you know, it's tricky. You've got to find, you know, lyrics that resonate, that help it, and something that, you know, musically is climactic as well. But, you know, music is something that I grew up with and did, and so that's just been a sort of happy accident that happened on this show, and that they've drawn on my sort of musical knowledge and stuff to progress the musical notion of Lucifer in the show.
Yeah. And one of the things that feels very serendipitous with the way that this role came about for you was, you know, you've mentioned how going out for pilot season at that point, that for you, it's not just about getting the work, it's about what's the right job, what's something that's going to really kind of fulfill you creatively. But earlier on in your career, when you were first out of drama school, you were just kind of taking whatever opportunity came your way, as many people have to, you know, just to be a working actor is such a challenge. And, you know, but I think there's such a fascinating experience within that, because you got to do so many different things. You were dipping into movies, into television, into theater, really working in all those different mediums. And how did that really allow your craft to evolve in a unique way, in getting to try out so many different things early on and being stretched in so many different ways creatively?
I think, well, the one thing you don't learn at drama school is actually how to turn up and do a job. It's weird. It prepares you for lots of things, but like, you know, the notion of being on a TV or film set, you'll never have that experience until you do it. So it was the best piece of advice I got at drama school was just take everything you can for the first couple of years. And that's, you know, under the assumption that you're even going to book jobs. But doing all those different things, you know, it was great because I got to work with lots of experienced people. And I observed a lot during that time of how different people work and people that I really admire and respect, and people whose careers I'd like to kind of emulate and stuff. So I was like a sponge for you know, the first 5 years of my acting career, really. And part of the, you know, being judicious at this stage in my career, it comes from I want to say a knowledge or a comfort or a sense that I will work, because that is the biggest hurdle to get over as the actor in the first instance. It's like, oh, I'm never going to work again. You know, every actor does it, even actors that have a huge degree of success. It's like, oh, I'm never going to work again after this. And the reality is that some people know that they probably will. This probably will be their career after a certain while. They seem to have been booking jobs and there's a natural progression that seems to be happening. And I found myself in that category. And then other things come into play, you know, like your life and whether you have children or whether you have a partner, and you know, how long something takes to film, all these kind of like things that you have to think about. Where something's going to film, really important. If you're in a position where you feel like you have the luxury of choice there, that's really important. And then first, you know, the thing about like Lucifer, for example, I'd been over here auditioning for pilots, and I, you know, here's the reality: you can do a lot of pilots and none of them happen, but you have to think one of them might turn into a series. And if it were to turn into a series, do you want to be doing this for the next 6 years of your life? And you know, the more experience you get, the more you can sort of see how things are going to pan out. So Lucifer, if it had just been a procedural show and I wasn't the devil in it and I was just a police detective solving a murder every week, I, as Tom, don't think that's what I want to do. I did no disrespect to that, but I know that, like, you know, I'm spending a huge time away from my children, for example. I want to be stimulated on a daily basis creatively when I'm doing the job that I'm doing. And, you know, so that's where my judicious, you know, feelings come from. And something like Rush before this and something like Lucifer, when those scripts come in and I look at the character, I think that is a character that I definitely could live with for a few years. And I could definitely have a lot of fun with, and I could definitely, you know, do lots of different things within that character. I mean, like you say, Lucifer for me is, it's like the sort of Dick Van Dyke of characters, because he just does so many different things, you know, throughout the 6 years I've been doing the show. And that for me keeps me on my toes as a performer and keeps me from going stale. Yeah. And that's what I look for, basically, that stimulus.
Yeah. I also love that, you know, your drama school was also encouraging you and other students to take paid work and to take work within the industry as you were still studying. And one of the ones that really kind of piqued my interest was that you went off to do pantomime with James McAvoy for Beauty and the Beast. You know, and but pantomime has such a specific comedic style to it that I think is really interesting. And I wanted to ask you about that in terms of what that really taught you about comedic timing and comedic performances, because you've obviously gone on to do so many great comedic performances, whether it's roles on Miranda pulling Catherine Tate show, and kind of how that was like an initial launching pad and great learning curve and opportunity for you.
Well, I always loved comedy. I always loved funny plays, and I always loved working on funny plays and working within comedy. Even though I was training as a dramatic actor, comedy was always something that I felt was a natural stomping ground for me. So, you know, going off to do panto, I was very fortunate, you know, that our drama school had that philosophy. But it was great because it was that same thing of like, I was suddenly working with professional actors who had done this for a while and worked within these realms. And I was in a rehearsal room witnessing people do really funny stuff and really pushing it. And, you know, particularly knew how to do the thing that we were doing, because that's another key thing when you're an actor, is like, you've really got to know what it is that you're in. Best bit of advice I ever had, Mark Strong, there you go. Know what you're in and don't fight it. Because that's, you know, that's part of the fun, finding the tone of the piece. And obviously panto is a ridiculous tone, but it's, you know, once you find yourself working in that realm, it unlocks all these kind of, oh, that's funny, this is funny, you can do that in this scenario, you can do that in these circumstances. So yeah, again, it was that being a sponge and taking it all up. I think the biggest thing I ever learned comedy on, though, was from Miranda, like literally from Miranda Hart herself. And you know, she wrote every episode of that show, and the way that her mind works, and the way that we would be in rehearsal, for example, you know, because we were rehearsing to shoot something in front of a live audience, and Miranda knew where the laughs were going to be. And we'd be rehearsing, and she'd be like, you know, you're going to have to hold there on the day because there will be a laugh there. And you'll be like, really? And on the day, lo and behold, there was a big fat laugh. She just knew the science of comedy inside and out. And part of that was, she'd learned that, and part of it was in her. And, you know, having that experience and working alongside her in that format for all those years, it really, really gave me a lot of confidence about working in comedy.
Yeah. Well, there's also such an interesting dynamic to the way that that show was filmed, in that it constantly was also breaking the fourth wall.
Yeah.
In terms of the way that it acknowledged the audience and pulled it in. So did that kind of create a different style of comedic performance that you were looking to because of that?
I think, well, much like pantomime, it's like, you know, there's that direct address to the audience. It's like letting people in on the joke. And that was something Miranda really wanted to do from the start. You know, she was a huge Eric Morecambe fan. And that was a huge part of Eric's shtick, was that he would, like, you know, they'd be doing a sketch together and he'd turn it out to the camera and give a funny look as if to go, are you guys watching this? Are you thinking what I'm thinking? It's that kind of like, it's that knowingness. And, you know, it was a great device for that show because it made that show tick. And, you know, it was a lot of shameless fun that we had on it. But Miranda's connection with the audience was the glue that kept it going, and the thing that kept people engaged and felt like they were in on the joke. So it was very specific to that, but it is something that is used, you know, it's used a lot in the theatre. You know, think of famous, you know, plays recently like One Man, Two Governors, that was a huge hit. You know, a lot of that was about direct address to the audience and letting them in. So it's something that's been done for years and years and years, but not so much in a TV format. And that's why it was so much fun.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for talking to us, not just about that, but obviously Lucifer as well.
Of course.
And really looking forward to the second half of season 5, and hope that you're able to get back into production to finish everything up. And
fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mara.